The sun cast its dying light over the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, painting the Wyoming territory in a wash of amber and gold as Penelope Nash stood before her husband's grave, the earth still fresh. It had been 3 months since Charles Nash had been gunned down in a bank robbery gone wrong. Yet the hollow ache in her chest remained as raw as the day the sheriff had knocked on her door with his hat in hand and sorrow in his eyes. "I should never have come west with you," she whispered to the wooden cross, her gloved fingers tracing the carved letters of his name. "But you were so certain this land would give us a future." The year was 1876, and at 25, Penelope was already a widow, left with nothing but a small house on the edge of town and memories that haunted her dreams. The frontier had promised so much freedom, opportunity, a chance to build something lasting. Instead, it had stolen everything she loved. As dusk settled over the cemetery, Penelope became aware of approaching hoofbeats. She didn't turn, assuming it was just another traveler passing through. Redemption Creek saw many such drifters, cowboys and prospectors chasing fortunes or running from pasts best forgotten. "Madam," a deep voice called out, "cemetery's no place for a lady after dark, especially not alone." Penelope turned, her eyes meeting those of a stranger atop a chestnut mare. The man was tall, his face weathered by sun and wind, yet his eyes held a gentleness that belied his rugged appearance. His dark hair curled beneath a dust-covered hat, and a week's worth of stubble lined his jaw. "I appreciate your concern," she replied stiffly, "but I know my way home." The stranger dismounted with fluid grace, revealing a slight limp as he approached. He removed his hat, revealing more of those dark curls, and stopped a respectful distance away. "Clayton Tucker," he introduced himself with a slight nod. "I don't mean to intrude on your grief." Penelope studied him, noting the way he carried himself confident yet cautious, like a man who'd seen his share of troubles but hadn't surrendered to them. "How do you know I'm grieving?" she asked. He gestured toward the grave. "Fresh dirt, the way you're standing, the look in your eyes." His voice softened. "I know it when I see it." Something in his tone suggested personal acquaintance with loss. Penelope felt her defensiveness waver slightly. "My husband," she said simply. 3 months ago." Clayton nodded, saying nothing for a moment. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, merely contemplative. "I buried my heart with him," Penelope found herself admitting, surprised at confessing such a thing to a stranger. Perhaps it was easier precisely because he was unknown to her, carrying no expectations or memories of who she had been before. Clayton's eyes met hers, steady and warm. "Then let mine beat for you a while," he said quietly. "Not to replace what you've lost, madam. Just to remind you that you're not alone in this world." The unexpected gentleness of his words caught Penelope off guard, and she felt something stir within her, not love or even attraction, but simply recognition. Recognition of a kindred soul who understood what it meant to stand on the precipice of emptiness and face the vast uncertainty of tomorrow. "I'm Penelope Nash," she finally said, "and I should be getting home before dark." "May I escort you?" Clayton asked, gathering his horse's reins. "These streets aren't always safe after sundown." Penelope hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Thank you, Mr. Tucker." They walked in silence through the growing darkness, her small house at the edge of town their destination. The clip-clop of the mare's hoofs punctuated their journey, a rhythmic counterpoint to the evening's cricket chorus. "Are you passing through?" Penelope asked as they neared her home, a modest structure with a small front porch that Charles had built with his own hands. "Looking to settle, actually," Clayton replied. "I've had my fill of wandering." "Took a position with the Henderson Ranch outside of town." "Old man Henderson hired you?" Penelope couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Jacob Henderson was notoriously particular about who worked his land. Clayton smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face. "I have a way with horses, and Mr. Henderson has a prized stallion with a temperament that's been giving his stable hands trouble." They reached Penelope's gate, and she turned to face him. "Thank you for walking me home, Mr. Tucker." "Clayton, please," he said, replacing his hat. "And it was my honor, Mrs. Nash." "Penelope," she corrected, surprising herself again. "Penelope," he echoed, her name sounding somehow different in his deep timbre. "Perhaps I'll see you in town sometime." "Perhaps," she agreed, though she rarely ventured beyond her home and the cemetery these days. The community's pitying glances had become too much to bear. As Clayton Tucker tipped his hat and mounted his horse, Penelope watched him ride away, an unfamiliar sensation fluttering in her chest. It wasn't happiness, she had forgotten what that felt like, but it was something other than grief, and that itself seemed a small miracle. Penelope entered her empty house, lighting a lamp that cast wavering shadows across the walls. For the first time in months, she found herself thinking about someone other than Charles and the future they would never have. She thought instead of a stranger's kind eyes and his unexpected offer not of love, but of companionship in a world that suddenly seemed too large and too empty. "Let mine beat for you a while," she repeated his words softly to herself, placing a hand over her heart, feeling its steady rhythm beneath her palm. She wasn't ready to feel anything again, wasn't sure she ever would be. But tonight, at least, she recognized that her heart continued to beat, even if it felt hollow inside her chest. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, a hint of autumn in the air despite the summer heat that would follow by midday. Penelope rose early as was her habit, dressing in the simple black garments that marked her widowhood. She had errands to run in town, supplies to purchase, and a letter to post to her sister back east. The general store was busy when she arrived, farmers and their wives gathering necessities for the coming week. Penelope kept her head down, avoiding conversation beyond what was necessary to complete her purchases. As she waited for Mr. Simmons to wrap her parcels, the bell above the door jingled, announcing a new arrival. "Morning, Mr. Tucker," Simmons called out cheerfully. "Settling in at Henderson's, all right?" Penelope stiffened at the name, her back to the door. "Can't complain," Clayton's familiar voice replied. "That stallion's coming around nicely." "Never thought I'd see the day someone could handle that beast," Simmons chuckled. "Henderson's mighty pleased, I hear." Penelope gathered her courage and turned slightly, acknowledging Clayton with a small nod as he caught sight of her. "Mrs. Nash," he greeted her, removing his hat. His hair was damp, as though he'd recently bathed, and he'd shaved the stubble from his jaw, revealing a strong chin with a small scar near the corner of his mouth. "Mr. Tucker," she replied formally, aware of the curious glances from other customers. In a town this size, any interaction between a widow and an unmarried man would fuel gossip for days. "Permit me to carry those parcels for you," he offered, nodding toward her purchases. Before she could respond, Mr. Simmons handed over her wrapped goods with a knowing smile that made Penelope's cheeks warm. "I can manage," she insisted, but Clayton had already taken the largest bundle. "I'm headed in your direction anyway," he said easily, defusing the moment. "No sense in you struggling when I have two perfectly good arms." Outside, the morning sunshine bathed the street in golden light. Penelope walked beside Clayton, conscious of the distance between them and the eyes that might be watching from shop windows. "You needn't have done that," she said quietly. "People will talk." Clayton's expression remained untroubled. "People always talk, Mrs. Nash. It's what keeps them occupied between planting and harvest." A reluctant smile tugged at her lips. "Nevertheless, a widow must be careful of her reputation. And a gentleman must be mindful of his manners," he countered, adjusting the parcel under his arm. My mother would have my hide if I let a lady carry heavy packages while I walked empty-handed. Penelope studied him from the corner of her eye. You speak of your mother in the present tense. She's still living, then? Clayton nodded. Back in Missouri. Writes me every month. Regular as clockwork. Mostly to ask when I'm going to settle down with a nice girl and give her grandchildren. He added with a wry smile. And what do you tell her? Penelope asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. Clayton didn't seem to mind. That I haven't found a woman willing to put up with me for more than a dance or two. His expression grew more serious. Truth is, this life doesn't lend itself well to family. Too dangerous. Too uncertain. Charles said something similar when we first met. Penelope found herself saying, I convinced him otherwise. And now you regret it? Clayton asked gently. Penelope stopped walking, forcing him to pause beside her. I regret his death every moment of every day, she said, her voice steady despite the pain lancing through her. But I would never regret loving him, even knowing how it would end. Clayton regarded her with those perceptive eyes. That's a rare kind of courage, Penelope Nash. Not courage, she corrected. Merely the truth. They resumed walking, a companionable silence between them until they reached her gate. As Clayton handed over her parcels, his fingers brushed against hers briefly. Thank you, she said, meaning more than just the assistance with her purchases. My pleasure, he replied, understanding in his gaze. Henderson's giving the hands Sunday afternoon off. I thought I might attend services at the church in town. It was a question without being one, and Penelope found herself nodding. Reverend Miller gives a fine sermon. Clayton replaced his hat. Then perhaps I'll see you there. As he walked away, Penelope realized she was looking forward to Sunday for the first time in months. Sunday arrived with the clear, bright skies that made Wyoming summers bearable despite the heat. Penelope dressed with particular care, still in her widow's black but with a touch more attention to her appearance than had become her habit. She braided her chestnut hair neatly and pinned it at the nape of her neck, studying her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. The face that looked back at her seemed different, somehow thinner than before Charles's death. Certainly, with shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of restless nights. But there was something else there too, a spark that had been absent for months. She wasn't ready to name it hope, but it was something other than the deadened acceptance that had become her constant companion. The church bell began to toll as Penelope walked down the main street, nodding politely to those she passed. Inside the whitewashed building, she took her customary seat near the back, where she could slip out quietly if grief overwhelmed her, as it sometimes did during the more joyful hymns. She felt rather than saw Clayton enter, his tall figure pausing in the doorway as his eyes adjusted to the dimmer light inside. Several heads turned, curious about the newcomer in their midst. Redemption Creek didn't see many new faces that stayed longer than a night or two at the hotel. For a moment, Penelope thought he might join her, but instead, Clayton took a seat several rows ahead, next to some of the other ranch hands from Henderson's place. She felt an unexpected twinge of disappointment, followed immediately by relief. It was too soon for the town to connect them in any way. Reverend Miller's sermon that day focused on rebirth and renewal, drawing parallels between the changing seasons and the human capacity for growth even after devastation. Penelope found herself listening more intently than she had in months, the words seeming to speak directly to her situation in a way that felt almost uncanny. The winter of grief may seem endless. The Reverend's deep voice resonated through the small church. But spring always follows, bringing new life where once there was only barrenness. After the final hymn, congregants filtered out into the sunshine, gathering in small groups to exchange the week's news and gossip. Penelope usually slipped away quickly, but today she found herself lingering, watching as Clayton was introduced to various townspeople by Jacob Henderson himself, a sign of the old rancher's approval. As if sensing her gaze, Clayton looked up, their eyes meeting across the churchyard. He nodded slightly, a gesture of recognition but not familiarity, respectful of her position and reputation. Penelope returned the nod before turning to walk home, a strange sense of anticipation following her like a shadow. The next week passed with no sign of Clayton in town, though Penelope found herself looking for him whenever she ventured out for supplies or to tend Charles's grave. She told herself it was merely curiosity about a new face in their small community. Nothing more. On Friday afternoon, as Penelope was hanging laundry in her small backyard, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her pause. Shading her eyes against the sun, she watched as a rider approached her house. Clayton, leading a second horse behind him. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Nash," he called from the road, not presuming to enter her property uninvited. Penelope wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the fence. "Mr. Tucker, this is unexpected." He dismounted, leading both horses to her gate. The second animal was a gentle-looking mare with a dappled gray coat. "Henderson asked me to deliver this lady to Mrs. Garrett over on Pine Street," Clayton explained. "Her husband purchased her as a birthday gift. I thought I might stop and see how you're faring." Penelope appreciated his transparency about his reason for being in her neighborhood. "I'm well enough," she replied. "And you? Settling into ranch life?" "It suits me," he said with a slight smile. "Though town has its attractions too." The way he looked at her made it clear she was among those attractions, and Penelope felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She changed the subject quickly. "She's beautiful," she said, nodding toward the mare. "Your employer has an eye for good horseflesh. Do you ride, Mrs. Nash?" Clayton asked, stroking the mare's neck. Penelope nodded. "I did before Charles died. We had a gelding, but I had to sell him to pay some of the doctor's bills." Clayton's expression softened with understanding. "That's a shame. Riding can be a comfort when the world seems too close around you." "Yes," Penelope agreed, surprised at his insight. "It was one of the few things I missed after coming west. In Pennsylvania, my father kept several horses, and I rode nearly every day." "Henderson has more horses than he needs," Clayton said casually. "This one's sister is just as gentle but hasn't been promised to anyone. If you ever wanted to ride again." The offer hung in the air between them, neither an improper suggestion nor an ordinary neighborly gesture, something in between that Penelope wasn't quite sure how to categorize. "That's very kind," she said finally, "but I'm not sure I'm ready." Clayton nodded, accepting her answer without pressing. "The offer stands, whenever you might be ready." He glanced at the son's position. "I should deliver this girl to her new owner before Mrs. Garrett thinks her surprise has been forgotten." "Of course," Penelope said, strangely reluctant to see him go. Clayton hesitated, then spoke again. "Henderson's hosting a harvest dance at the ranch next Saturday. The whole town's invited." He cleared his throat slightly. "It would be good to see you there if you felt so inclined." Before Penelope could respond, he tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and continued down the road, the mare following obediently behind. Penelope watched him go, her hands gripping the fence posts. A harvest dance. She hadn't attended any social functions since Charles's death. It seemed disrespectful somehow, to seek enjoyment while he lay cold in the ground. And yet, life continued. The seasons changed. Winter gave way to spring, as Reverend Miller had reminded them. Perhaps it wasn't disloyal to Charles's memory to remember that she was still living. The week passed in a blur of indecision for Penelope. Each morning, she woke certain she would not attend the harvest dance. Each evening found her staring at the blue dress hanging in her wardrobe, the only non-black garment she owned. preserved from the days before her mourning began. On Saturday morning, she finally took it out, smoothing the fabric with trembling hands. It had been Charles's favorite, the color reminding him of the Pennsylvania skies they'd left behind. Would wearing it honor his memory or betray it? Penelope couldn't decide. As dusk approached, she found herself bathing and washing her hair, still uncertain whether she would actually go. She dried and brushed her chestnut locks until they gleamed, leaving them loose around her shoulders instead of in her usual severe bun. Almost without conscious decision, she put on the blue dress, its familiar weight both comforting and strange after months of black crepe and bombazine. Looking in the mirror, Penelope barely recognized herself. The woman who stared back had color in her cheeks and a spark in her green eyes that had been absent for too long. "What am I doing, Charles?" she whispered to the empty room. No answer came, only the soft September breeze through the open window, carrying the distant sounds of music from the Henderson ranch. Penelope closed her eyes, remembering Charles as he had been in life, laughing, vibrant, always pushing her to embrace experiences rather than hide from them. "You would want me to go," she realized aloud. "You would tell me to dance." With newfound resolve, she pinned a simple cameo at her throat, took her shawl from its hook, and stepped out into the gathering dusk. The walk to Henderson's ranch took nearly half an hour, giving Penelope ample time to second-guess her decision. Twice she nearly turned back, but the music growing louder with each step drew her forward like an invisible thread. The ranch house and barn were ablaze with lantern light, transformed from working buildings into a festive gathering place. Wagons and horses lined the yard, evidence that most of the town had accepted Henderson's invitation. For a moment, Penelope stood at the edge of the light, gathering her courage. "Mrs. Nash?" a surprised voice called out. It was Martha Wilson, the blacksmith's wife, approaching with a welcoming smile. "How wonderful to see you here. Come, let me get you some punch." Before Penelope could protest, she found herself swept into the barn, which had been cleared of hay and equipment to create a dance floor. Tables laden with food lined one wall, while a small group of musicians played near another. Townspeople Penelope had known for years but barely spoken to since Charles's death greeted her warmly, though she caught the occasional surprised glance at her blue dress. "It's good to see you out again," Sheriff Adams said kindly, tipping his hat as he passed with his wife. "We've missed you at the quilting circle," Mrs. Peterson added, squeezing Penelope's hand. Penelope felt overwhelmed by the warmth of their welcome, having convinced herself that the town had forgotten her in her self-imposed isolation. She accepted a cup of punch from Martha and found a quiet corner to observe the dancing, content for now just to be present among the living. She spotted Clayton across the room, deep in conversation with Jacob Henderson. He wore a clean white shirt with a black vest, his dark hair neatly combed, looking more like a gentleman rancher than the dusty cowboy who had approached her in the cemetery. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, surprise and pleasure crossing his features when he saw her. Excusing himself from his employer, Clayton made his way through the crowd toward her, stopping to exchange greetings along the way. By the time he reached her side, Penelope's heart was beating faster than it had in months. "You came," he said simply, his eyes taking in her blue dress with obvious appreciation. "I surprised myself," she admitted. "Blue suits you," Clayton said, "though I imagine every color does." The compliment brought heat to Penelope's cheeks. "Thank you. You look quite—" She hesitated, then finished, "respectable yourself." Clayton laughed, a rich sound that made several nearby dancers turn their heads. High praise indeed. Henderson insisted we all clean up proper for the occasion. The musicians began a new song, slower than the previous ones. Clayton glanced at the dance floor, then back at Penelope, a question in his eyes. I haven't danced since before Charles died, she said quietly. I understand, Clayton nodded, not pressing further. Penelope took a deep breath. But perhaps it's time I remembered how. Something like joy flickered across Clayton's face. I'd be honored, Mrs. Nash, he said formally, offering his arm. As they took their places among the other dancers, Penelope felt the weight of curious stares. Tomorrow there would be talk about the widow Nash dancing with the new ranch hand. Tonight she found she didn't care. Clayton's hand at her waist was respectful, keeping the proper distance between them as they moved in time to the music. His slight limp was barely noticeable as he guided her through the simple steps. May I ask what happened? Penelope inquired, nodding toward his leg. War injury, he replied. Battle of Chancellorsville. Confederate cavalry charge caught us by surprise. You fought for the Union, then? Clayton nodded. Enlisted at 19. Spent the last year of the war in a hospital in Washington. I'm sorry, Penelope said, understanding now the shadows that sometimes darkened his eyes. It was a lifetime ago, he said, though his expression suggested the memories remained fresh. What about you? How did you come to be in Redemption Creek? As they danced, Penelope found herself telling him about meeting Charles at a church social in Pennsylvania, his dreams of building a life in the West, their difficult journey across the plains, and the 3 years they'd spent in Redemption Creek before the robbery that had taken his life. He sounds like a good man, Clayton said when she finished. He was, Penelope agreed, surprised to find that speaking of Charles brought more warmth than pain. He would have liked you, I think. The dance ended, and Clayton escorted her back to the refreshment table. They spent the remainder of the evening together, sometimes dancing, sometimes simply talking as they watched others enjoy the festivities. By the time the musicians played their final song, Penelope felt more alive than she had in months. Allow me to walk you home, Clayton said as the gathering began to disperse. Though Penelope knew it would cement the town's speculation about them, she nodded her acceptance. They walked beneath a canopy of stars, the autumn air crisp around them. Thank you, she said as they neared her house, for encouraging me to attend tonight. I'm glad you came, Clayton replied, his voice soft in the darkness. It was good to see you smile. They reached her gate, and Penelope turned to face him. In the moonlight, his features were cast in silver and shadow, making him look almost otherworldly. Would you consider riding with me tomorrow? He asked. I've spoken to Henderson, and he's happy for you to borrow that mare I mentioned. Penelope hesitated only briefly. I would like that, she said finally. I'll come by after church, Clayton promised. As he turned to leave, Penelope called after him. Clayton? He looked back, eyebrows raised in question. When I said I buried my heart with Charles, she said carefully, I meant it. I don't know if I can ever feel that way again. Clayton's expression was gentle in the moonlight. I meant what I said too. My heart can beat for both of us while yours heals. No expectations beyond that. As she watched him walk away, Penelope realized that for the first time since Charles's death, she was looking forward to tomorrow. True to his word, Clayton arrived the next afternoon leading 2 horses, his chestnut mare, and a dappled gray similar to the one he'd delivered to Mrs. Garrett. Penelope was waiting, dressed in her most practical skirt and a simple white blouse, her hair braided and pinned securely for riding. This is Willow, Clayton said, patting the gray's neck. She's gentle but spirited like someone else I know, he added with a smile. Penelope approached the horse carefully, extending her hand for Willow to sniff. The mare nudged her palm affectionately, seeming to approve of her new riding companion. She's lovely, Penelope said, stroking the horse's velvety nose. Need a hand up? Clayton offered. Penelope shook her head. I may be out of practice, but I remember how. With practiced ease, she gathered the reins and mounted, settling into the saddle as though she'd never left it. The familiar feeling of a horse beneath her brought an unexpected rush of joy. Clayton swung onto his own mount, and they set off at a leisurely pace, heading away from town toward the rolling hills that surrounded Redemption Creek. The September sunshine warmed their backs as they rode side by side, talking easily about everything and nothing. "How did you come to have such a way with horses?" Penelope asked as they paused to let the animals drink from a clear stream. Clayton's expression grew distant for a moment. "My father raised horses in Missouri before the war. I spent more time in the stables than in the schoolhouse." He smiled slightly, much to my mother's dismay. "And after the war? Why come west instead of returning home?" He was silent for so long that Penelope thought he might not answer. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Home wasn't the same. The war changed everything, the land, the people, me." Clayton absently rubbed his injured leg. "My father died while I was fighting. The farm was sold to pay debts. There was nothing to go back to except memories." "I'm sorry," Penelope said softly, understanding the loss in a way few others could. Clayton shrugged, his expression lightening. "It led me here, so perhaps it was for the best after all." Their eyes met across the stream, and something unspoken passed between them, recognition of shared pain, but also of the possibility that lay ahead. They continued their ride, climbing a gentle slope that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. Redemption Creek looked tiny from this distance, a collection of wooden buildings nestled against the vast wilderness. "It's beautiful," Penelope breathed, seeing her adopted home through new eyes. "Yes," Clayton agreed, though when she turned, she found him looking at her rather than the view. They dismounted to rest the horses, sitting side by side on a fallen log. Clayton produced bread, cheese, and apples from his saddlebag, a simple but welcome meal after their ride. "I haven't been this far from town since we first arrived," Penelope admitted, biting into a crisp apple. Charles always wanted to explore, but there was so much work to be done on the house and his business. "What did he do?" Clayton asked. "He was a carpenter by trade," Penelope explained. "Built half the furniture in town, and was starting on a contract to make new pews for the church when he died." "That explains the quality of work in your home," Clayton observed. "I noticed the craftsmanship of your porch railing." Penelope smiled, touched that he'd paid attention to such a detail. Charles took pride in his work. He used to say that anything worth building was worth building well. "A philosophy that applies to more than carpentry," Clayton noted. They fell into companionable silence, watching as a hawk circled lazily overhead. The afternoon light began to soften, warning that they should start back soon. "Thank you for today," Penelope said as they prepared to mount up again. "I'd forgotten how much I missed this." Clayton helped her onto Willow, his hands strong and steady at her waist. "The offer stands whenever you wish to ride. Henderson says you're welcome to borrow Willow anytime." As they rode back toward town, Penelope realized she felt lighter somehow, as though the day's excursion had lifted a weight she'd been carrying for months. She wasn't ready to let go of her grief entirely, it was still too much a part of her, but perhaps there was room for other feelings alongside it. The weeks that followed fell into a pleasant pattern. Clayton would come to town on his days off, sometimes to escort Penelope on rides, other times simply to help with repairs around her small house that she'd been unable to manage alone. The town's initial gossip about them gradually gave way to acceptance as it became clear that Clayton treated the widow Nash with nothing but respect. October brought cooler weather and vibrant autumn colors to the hills around Redemption Creek. On a particularly golden afternoon, Clayton arrived at Penelope's door with Willow and his own horse, Ember, already saddled. "I have something to show you," he said by way of greeting. his eyes alight with anticipation. Intrigued, Penelope agreed, and soon they were riding along unfamiliar trails, climbing higher into the hills than they'd ventured before. The trees around them blazed with fall colors, brilliant reds, oranges, and golds, creating a canopy of fire above their heads. After nearly an hour's ride, Clayton led them into a small clearing surrounded by aspen trees, their leaves shimmering like golden coins in the breeze. In the center of the clearing stood a simple wooden structure, the beginnings of a cabin, its foundation and framework complete, but its walls still open to the elements. "What is this place?" Penelope asked, dismounting to look more closely. Clayton swung down from Ember, a hint of nervousness in his expression. "It's mine, or it will be once it's finished. Henderson granted me the land as part of my wages, says he prefers his foreman to have a stake in the territory." "Foreman?" Penelope echoed, surprised. "You've been promoted?" Clayton nodded, unable to hide his pride. "Last week. The old foreman's moving to California, and Henderson asked me to take his place." "Congratulations," Penelope said warmly. "You've clearly impressed him." "It means I'm staying," Clayton said, his eyes holding hers. "Putting down roots." The implications of his words hung in the air between them. Over the past weeks, their friendship had deepened into something more, though neither had put a name to it yet. "It's a beautiful spot," Penelope said, looking around at the clearing. "The view must be magnificent in all seasons." "Come see," Clayton offered, leading her to where the cabin's front porch would eventually stand. From that vantage point, they could see all the way down the valley to Redemption Creek and beyond. The landscape spread before them like a painting. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of the season. "It's breathtaking," Penelope whispered. "I thought so too the first time I came up here," Clayton agreed, standing close beside her. "I knew then that this was where I wanted to build something lasting." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a naturalness that no longer surprised her. Over the past weeks, such small touches had become common between them, a hand at the small of her back, fingers brushing as they walked, comfort offered and accepted in equal measure. "Henderson's given me the winter to complete it," Clayton continued. "By spring, it should be ready for—" He hesitated, then finished simply, "for the future." Penelope understood what he wasn't saying. He was building this place with hope in his heart, hope that included her. The realization should have frightened her, but instead, it filled her with a warm certainty. "It's going to be wonderful," she said softly. They stayed until the setting sun painted the clearing in shades of amber and gold, talking about the cabin's design, the furniture it would need, the garden Penelope suggested might thrive in the sheltered area to the south. Neither spoke directly of shared plans, but as they rode home in the gathering dusk, something had shifted between them. A possibility had taken shape, no longer nebulous but almost tangible, a future neither had expected to find. As autumn deepened toward winter, Clayton divided his time between his duties at Henderson's ranch and work on his cabin. Whenever possible, Penelope joined him, bringing food and offering suggestions as the walls rose and the roof was raised. Sometimes they worked in companionable silence. Other times, they shared stories of their pasts, filling in the empty spaces in their knowledge of each other. On a crisp November day, as Clayton installed windows in the nearly completed cabin, Penelope unpacked a basket of food she'd brought for their midday meal. "This reminds me of when Charles and I first came to Redemption Creek," she said, spreading a cloth over a rough-hewn table Clayton had crafted. "We lived in a tent while he built our house. I'd cook over an open fire, and we'd eat watching the stars come out." Clayton paused in his work, studying her expression. "Does it pain you to speak of him now?" Penelope considered the question seriously. "No," she realized. "Not anymore. The memories are still there, but they're gentler now, like looking at a photograph rather than an open wound. I'm glad, Clayton said simply, setting down his tools and joining her at the table. As they ate, snow began to fall, the first real snowfall of the season, fat flakes drifting down to dust the clearing with white. We should head back before it gets heavier, Clayton said, glancing at the sky with a practiced eye. They packed quickly, but by the time they mounted their horses, the snow was falling more steadily, accumulating on the ground and reducing visibility. Stay close, Clayton instructed as they set off down the trail. The journey back was slow and increasingly difficult as the snow deepened. What had been a clear path that morning was now obscured, forcing Clayton to dismount several times to confirm they were still on the right track. The temperature dropped rapidly, the wind picking up and driving the snow into blinding sheets. We need to turn back, Clayton called over the wind after nearly an hour of difficult travel. The cabin's closer than town now, and the storm's getting worse. Penelope, shivering despite her heavy coat, nodded her agreement. Her fingers were growing numb on the reins, and Willow was struggling against the mounting drifts. They turned the horses around, following their partially filled-in tracks back up the hillside. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was a welcome sight, its solid walls promising shelter from the worsening blizzard. Clayton helped Penelope dismount, her limbs stiff with cold, then quickly led the horses to the lean-to-heat constructed on the cabin's leeward side. He unsaddled them and rubbed them down with burlap sacks, ensuring they were as comfortable as possible before rejoining Penelope inside. The cabin's interior was Spartan but serviceable, a stone fireplace, the table and 2 chairs Clayton had built, and a bed frame in the corner, not yet fitted with a mattress. Penelope was already kneeling at the fireplace, her numb fingers struggling with flint and steel. Clayton quickly took over, skillfully building a fire that soon blazed welcomingly. As warmth gradually filled the single room, they shed their snow-covered outer garments, hanging them near the fire to dry. "Are you all right?" Clayton asked, noticing that Penelope was still shivering. "Just cold," she assured him. "The fire will help." Clayton retrieved a blanket from his supplies, wrapping it gently around her shoulders. "Better." Penelope nodded, grateful for his thoughtfulness. As feeling returned to her extremities, she looked around the cabin with new eyes. It was rough but solid, built with obvious care and attention to detail. The windows Clayton had installed that morning let in soft gray light, the glass panes blurred by snow that continued to fall heavily outside. "It appears we're weather-bound," she observed, trying to keep her tone light despite the impropriety of their situation. Clayton nodded, his expression serious. The storm could last through tomorrow, judging by those clouds. He met her eyes directly. "I know this puts you in a difficult position, Penelope. Your reputation is already the subject of town gossip." She finished for him with a small smile. "One more night of talk won't make much difference. Still, I want you to know that I'll sleep by the fire," Clayton said firmly. "You can take the bedroll in the corner." Penelope felt a rush of affection for this honorable man who had come into her life so unexpectedly. "Thank you," she said simply. As darkness fell, the storm intensified, wind howling around the cabin's sturdy walls. They shared the remainder of the food Penelope had brought, talking quietly as the fire cast dancing shadows across the room. "Tell me about your dreams," Penelope said as they sat side by side near the hearth, the blanket now shared between them. "Before the war, before everything changed, what did you want from life?" Clayton was silent for a moment, his eyes on the flames. "Simple things," he said finally. "Land of my own, horses to raise, a family." He glanced at her, then back to the fire. "After the war, I stopped dreaming for a while. It seemed presumptuous, I suppose. So many good men never came home. Who was I to want more than survival? And now, Penelope asked softly. Now I'm building again, he said. Not just this cabin. A future. He turned to face her fully, his expression open and vulnerable in the firelight. I know it may be too soon, Penelope. I know your heart still belongs partly to Charles. But I find myself hoping that someday, there might be room in it for me too. Penelope felt tears well in her eyes, not from sorrow but from the unexpected gift of his honesty. There already is, she whispered. Clayton's hand found hers beneath the blanket, their fingers intertwining as they had so many times before. But this time, there was a new certainty in the gesture, a promise unspoken but understood. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the cabin's walls, Penelope felt a peace she had thought lost forever. She wasn't betraying Charles by opening her heart again. She was honoring the love he had taught her to feel, carrying it forward into a new chapter. As the fire burned low, they reluctantly separated, Clayton insisting on keeping his word to sleep by the hearth while Penelope took the bedroll. Despite the hardship of being stranded, Penelope fell asleep more contented than she had been in months, lulled by the sound of the wind and the knowledge that she was no longer facing the future alone. Morning arrived with brilliant clarity, the storm having blown itself out overnight. Sunshine sparkled on unbroken snow that stretched in all directions, transforming the world into a dazzling white expanse. They set out for town as soon as the horses were ready, knowing that concerns about their absence would be mounting. The journey was slow but easier than the previous days, the trail more visible in daylight despite the deep snow. As they approached Redemption Creek, Penelope felt a momentary apprehension about the reception they might receive. Her fears were quickly allayed when Sheriff Adams rode out to meet them, relief rather than condemnation on his weathered face. "Thank the Lord you're safe," he called as he approached. Half the town was ready to form a search party once the storm cleared. "The snow caught us by surprise," Clayton explained. "We had to shelter at my cabin overnight." If the sheriff had any thoughts about the propriety of their situation, he kept them to himself. "Glad you had somewhere to wait it out," he said simply. "Mrs. Nash, your neighbor Mrs. Wilson, has been beside herself with worry. I'll ride ahead and let her know you're all right." As the sheriff departed, Clayton and Penelope exchanged glances, both suppressing smiles at the town's concern rather than criticism. They parted at Penelope's gate with promises to meet the following Sunday after church. As Clayton rode away toward Henderson's ranch, Penelope watched him go, a newfound certainty settling in her heart. The winter months passed in a rhythm of work and companionship. Whenever weather and duties permitted, Clayton continued construction on the cabin, now focusing on interior details. Penelope often joined him, bringing curtains she'd sewn or small touches to make the space more homelike. In town, their relationship was an acknowledged fact, though they maintained propriety in public. Clayton attended church beside Penelope each Sunday and became a familiar figure at community gatherings. His quiet competence and evident respect for Penelope gradually won over even the most traditional members of Redemption Creek society. As February's chill gave way to March's promise of spring, Clayton completed the last significant work on the cabin. To celebrate, he invited Penelope to ride up with him on a clear Saturday afternoon. The cabin that greeted them was transformed from the bare shelter of their snowbound night. Curtains hung at the windows, a proper mattress rested on the bed frame, and shelves lined one wall, ready for books and keepsakes. A rocking chair sat near the fireplace, a surprise Clayton had crafted in secret, the wood smoothed to a satiny finish. "It's perfect," Penelope breathed, running her hand along the chair's curved arm. "Almost," Clayton said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "There's one thing missing." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it carefully in his palm. It was a ring, a simple gold band with a single pearl set in its center. "I'm not asking you to forget Charles," Clayton said softly. "I would never want that. But I am asking if you might consider sharing your future with me. This cabin, a life together." Penelope looked at the ring, then at the man holding it, this gentle, honorable man who had patiently waited while her heart healed, never pushing, always supporting. "I buried my heart with Charles," she said, echoing her words from that first meeting in the cemetery. A shadow crossed Clayton's face, but before he could speak, she continued, "But you were right that day. Your heart has been beating for both of us all these months." She took his free hand, placing it over her chest so he could feel the steady rhythm beneath. "And now mine is beating again too, Clayton. For you." Joy transformed his features as he understood her meaning. "Is that a yes?" he asked, hardly daring to believe. "Yes," Penelope confirmed, her voice steady and sure. "Yes, I will marry you, Clayton Tucker." He slid the ring onto her finger, the pearl catching the afternoon light. As their lips met in a first, tender kiss, Penelope felt the last fragments of ice around her heart melt away. This wasn't an ending to her love for Charles, but a continuation of her capacity to love at all, a gift she had thought forever lost, now found again. They were married in April, when the hills around Redemption Creek were carpeted with wildflowers. The whole town turned out for the ceremony, held in the small church where they had first exchanged glances months before. Jacob Henderson stood as Clayton's best man, while Martha Wilson, who had become Penelope's close friend during the winter months, served as matron of honor. Reverend Miller spoke of renewal and second chances, of love that perseveres even through the darkest valleys. As Penelope and Clayton exchanged their vows, many in the congregation dabbed at their eyes, moved by the evident joy on the faces of the bride and groom. After the ceremony, the celebration continued at Henderson's ranch, where tables groaned under the weight of dishes contributed by every household in town. There was dancing and laughter, toasts and well wishes, the community coming together to celebrate new beginnings. As evening approached, the newlyweds slipped away, mounting their horses for the journey to their cabin on the hillside, their home now, filled with promise and possibility. Standing on the porch as the sunset painted the valley in shades of pink and gold, Clayton wrapped his arms around Penelope from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder as they surveyed the view that had first captured his imagination. "Happy?" he asked softly. Penelope turned in his arms, looking up into the face that had become as dear to her as her own reflection. "More than I ever thought I could be again," she answered honestly. "I will spend every day trying to keep it that way," Clayton promised, his voice husky with emotion. As their lips met, Penelope silently thanked Charles for teaching her to love, and Clayton for showing her she could love again. Two hearts, now beating as one against all odds in the vast wilderness of Wyoming territory, a miracle neither had dared to hope for, found in the most unexpected of places. 5 years later, the cabin on the hillside had expanded into a proper ranch house, with a stable of fine horses that were becoming known throughout the territory. Clayton's skill as a horseman and Penelope's head for business had combined to create a thriving enterprise that promised a secure future. On a summer evening much like the one when they had first met, Clayton returned from a long day of training a particularly spirited colt to find Penelope on the porch, their 3-year-old daughter Rebecca asleep in her lap and their infant son Charles nestled in a cradle beside her. "How are my treasures?" Clayton asked, climbing the steps to kiss his wife's upturned face. "Waiting for you?" Penelope smiled, her free hand reaching for his. Rebecca insisted on staying awake until Papa came home, but sleep won the battle. Clayton gently lifted his slumbering daughter, cradling her against his chest. "She's getting more stubborn every day," he observed with proud affection. "Wonder where she gets that from?" "Certainly not from me," Penelope replied with mock innocence. rising to check on their son, who slept peacefully despite their conversation. As they moved inside together, putting their children to bed before settling in for their own evening meal, Penelope was struck by a wave of gratitude so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "What is it?" Clayton asked, noticing her expression as they sat across from each other at the table. "I was just thinking," Penelope said softly, "about that day in the cemetery, how certain I was that my heart was buried forever." She reached across to take his hand. "I couldn't have imagined this, you, our children, this life we've built." Clayton's fingers tightened around hers. "I meant what I said that day," he reminded her. "I offered to let my heart beat for you until yours could beat on its own again." "I know," Penelope smiled. "But somewhere along the way, they started beating together, didn't they? And they'll keep on that way," Clayton promised, "for all the years to come." As night fell over the Wyoming hills, stars appearing like distant lanterns in the vast sky, Penelope Nash Tucker counted her blessings a love lost but honored in memory, a love found against all odds, and a future stretching before her like the endless prairie, full of promise and possibility. Her heart, once buried in grief, now beat strong and sure, carrying forward the best of her past into the bright hope of tomorrow.